So this is a new thing which we have started this year, and whenever I start new things, I just hope my delegate supports me, and I see some form of support, which is good enough. Anyway, jokes apart. Now, what we're doing this year in a mini end panel in innovation zone is we brought in experts, and we wanted to hear from them what are the innovations going on, not in the details, but in what sector, segment, and are we heading in the right direction? Is the innovations are happening in the right pace and the right areas? And if not, what needs to be done and how we can contribute to it? So the structure is all the experts, we're going to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then you have an opportunity to ask them questions. All right? Thank you. Now I'll hand it over to, let's start with Laurie because I was expecting him to start it. Cheers.
I guess I'll just kick off, and I'll ask the question of both of you, so feel welcome to chime in. In terms of the most transformational innovation that you've seen, or perhaps a story that, of an innovation that you've had exposure to, which you think has potential to magnify and manifest itself in the future, if you could share that story and maybe share those insights for how you see that manifesting in the future.
Thanks, Laurie. Look, there's probably a lot of different areas you could pick, but one of the areas I'm most interested in is the round about the kind of digital twin area. And I suppose it ties in a little bit more to the 4D and 5D. I didn't notice that. I knew it was digital twin, but look, my background's kind of computer electrical, and I've built a few things through the years, and I've included some structural things. And because I'm not a structural person, a mechanical person, I've seen us do some silly things when I've been managing that. For instance, maybe build a conveyor that's maybe nearly 2 kilometres long, and recognise once we've built it that you have to walk right down one end and right up the other to cross over the conveyor. And what's really interesting, I was given a demonstration of a technology not that long ago, and now of course what we're doing is we're actually building these conveyors digitally before we're actually running them. And we're not just building them as a box, there's where the conveyor sits, we're actually running them. I can actually see product running down a belt, right down to the point where you can actually see, well, this is where the person would walk over here. If this instrument gets triggered, so like if an instrument triggers and perhaps rips a conveyor belt, you can see where it's going to stop, what's going to happen, where it needs to be fixed, and how you're going to deal with it. And you can see all that right through a digital twin. I think that's got a really powerful opportunity, and generally in construction, but it kind of leads into some of the stuff I've seen in some of these presentations here. I'm a big believer in trying to model everything digitally as you can, especially sequencing and constructability, because it's that staging and the ability to move people and vehicles and equipment and plant all around a site that can really cause some headaches. And I've certainly seen situations where we've built things and then realised afterwards we can't get the crane in there to finish it because we've put a pipe across the location that the crane needs to get into. So these are the kind of things that come out when you can actually plan it ahead of practice. So probably not, there's a lot of different things you could pick, but that's the one thing that I've looked at and I went, wow, this could really change the game.
Yep, I back that 100%. So being BIM advocates, BIM is my number one thing that's changing. However, I do feel like the adoption of it is slower than what we would have anticipated. BIM is not a new concept by any means. It's over a decade old, maybe even over 2 or 3 decades old. It's more about how have we not adopted that already? It makes so much sense. Back in the early days, well, when I first started researching it, so that was about 13 to 15 years ago, we were made aware of BIM, so we started investigating it. I was a cadet back in the day, so it was cheap for me to sit in the corner and just tinker with this stuff and experiment a little bit. So I would just go in and look at models and see how they were put together to how I could pull it apart and get the data out of it. And it was a little bit clunky back over a decade ago, but now software and technology is just rapidly expanding, so we can do it really, really quickly. And the adoption of it could be a lot more quickly than me trying to figure out the complex way our model used to get built. Now we have software that's really kind of getting intuitive with how you actually extract things out of it. So I think the adoption will be faster, but I'm still surprised that we're not using it. The other gentleman's presentation today about 4D and kind of asking questions of why haven't we adopted it yet? And a lot of it comes down to people, about education and things like that. And the other one that I would say is changing our industry, or should change our industry, but again, I'm surprised at the rate of adoption or lack of, is prefabrication. It just makes so much sense to practice it or put it together in a warehouse and know it all fits together. Add that to a BIM situation, so you're actually practicing it in software, practicing it in the warehouse before you even knock it up on site. That makes complete sense to me. It doesn't make sense that we haven't adopted it more than we already have, actually. So it's more of a problem than a solution. The solution's there. It's more about adoption and refining it and making it better. Starting to do this AI, which is really, really cool stuff. How can we actually add all of these elements together and make it as efficient as possible?
Okay, that's a really good example. I think in particular because it's a technology advancement, but it's one that helps people on the journey, isn't it? Because people can visualise it, they can have those constructability reviews, those fabrication reviews with a live model. In terms of BIM adoption, there's a lot of detailed models. Does it have the potential to help projects and planning and decision making at conceptual stage? So is it something that you can have almost like a higher level model of before going to that detail level? Do you see value there?
Yes, and they do have that. So you're never going to start day dot with a model that has all the elements of a building, right down to every piece of stud, every piece of plasterboard and things like that, every door. You have to start with massing models and make sure it fits on site. There's also massing models that you can use metrics with. For example, cost planning, which is my area of expertise, is you start to mass up things and run scenarios in a live environment. So you're actually playing with situations or scenarios on one site, for example, massing up different scenarios and saying which is the best one for that. So certainly there's an opportunity at the start of the project to use it, whereas previously you'd kind of run two options because that's all you could afford to design at that point in time and say that one's better. Now you're actually saying, let's run 10 situations, let's run 20 scenarios over and over again and make it as refined as possible to be the most efficient. So how do we maximise the site to be the most efficient it possibly can? And it only gets better from there when we refine the detail out of it as well.
I don't think I can add any more to that.
No, that's okay. And I'm very curious. I'm a student of BIM, but completely see the potential in it. Another area that is obviously growing immensely is artificial intelligence. And a lot of the empowerment of artificial intelligence, particularly initially, is largely around well-structured data. And why BIM is really, I'm really curious about BIM because I see industry leading and innovating, and I'm not sure whether regulation is keeping up to speed to standardise formats and things like that. How is that going? And do you feel like in the future, as adoption does start to increase, all of a sudden it'll be almost like BIM Wave 2, where all of a sudden we're having machine learning and artificial intelligence suddenly propelling designs at us and things like that?
Look, it's an interesting point, and I can't speak specifically from a BIM perspective, but it's actually one of the questions I was potentially going to pose. Is there's an argument that data is almost like the fuel that drives AI, machine learning, and in the same way that we rely on governments to have to build infrastructure. So not everything in the world responds to competitive measures. So for instance, if everything was competitive, we wouldn't have roads in a lot of places we do, or railways, and so we expect governments to put certain things in place so that other businesses will invest and can see the opportunity. There's an argument going that we need to start getting that way with data, and you're beginning to see it in places in Europe when they're talking about things like data trusts, because every organisation is holding their data, but it's actually thwarting progress. And everyone wants to get the competitive advantage, but it's really a bit of a stalemate at the moment. We've got a situation where no one's really playing to win, everyone's playing not to lose. And so it's quite a defensive position. And the forward-thinking nations around the world who manage to encourage organisations who may even be in competition with each other to submit their data to a trust to allow the whole of their industry to move forward are going to end up overtaking other nations who don't. And so it's really an infrastructure type question, and governments have to get involved. It's not going to respond to competitive measures. If we do, we're just going to stay stuck in a stalemate. And I think if we really want to grease the wheels of innovation, we need to be able to start running. We can't create the next wave of innovation if we've got all the data sitting there but no one wants to give it up. we need to do something better than what we're doing at the moment.
And you'd also be surprised, more than just people having data and protecting it and not willing to release it, some people just don't collect the data. They just don't look back. They move on to the next one and the next one and the next one. And they're just saying, well, I built the last townhouse development for this much, blah, blah, blah. Next one should cost that one. And you just move on and on and on. And so that's probably a problem that we need to address, is gathering that data in the first instance. And a similarity in the BIM space for that is a mandate for an object library, or having this national database of being able to pull down model elements so everyone can kind of model with good data that has good inherent geometry with it as well. So what I mean by that is, when BIM was kind of early days, let's go back a decade ago, all these architects wouldn't release their models to the humble QS because they were afraid we were going to steal their data. I just wanted to utilise their data. I said, I'm not a designer, I won't do anything with it. And just through time and conversations, they've allowed us to have the models. But they were actually protective because, for example, they had one architect or one drafter use a model and spend weeks designing the perfect toilet in a model situation. It had the right curves and it had the push button. It looked like a toilet. It was beautiful. And they didn't want to release that because they didn't want a competitor having the same toilet. And in my mind, I'm like, it's a toilet. Now we have subcontractors and suppliers that are actually creating that model content from starters and saying, well, if you want to use a Reese toilet, we have that, and anybody can use it. So you're opening up this level playing field to say, well, that's not actually going to change the design of the building, it's how you go about it. We're just giving you the building blocks to be able to achieve that. And same with data. So once you actually release that information and say, get rid of the protectiveness around it, say, we actually want to use this, it's how you use the data, not what the data is in its infancy. It's how you use it.
Okay, that's really interesting, and I've heard similar kind of aspects in other areas that are advancing technologically. So the potential value for some level of standardisation to be mandated by government as a platform, a level platform, to allow data sharing and some of that sort of thing in other areas as well. You really led into my next question really well, which is about, as we start to digitise, the opportunity for data sharing becomes enhanced, and we have contractual relationships, intellectual property issues to deal with and stuff like that. How do you foresee that we can, do you think we can get to some sort of a relational-based platform where we can develop that trust and then empower value chains or supply chains, for example, to share data in a better and more integrated way without some of the commercial concerns that we used to have?
I'm not an expert on the ledger technology, but I believe this is one of the places that this is meant to go. So I haven't actually, it's funny, it's on my list of to-do things to actually step inside and see exactly how it works. But I know from the conceptual perspective that it's actually meant to mitigate that whole trust issue in terms of the granularity as to how the data can be shared and who owns it. And interestingly, I actually just made a post myself recently on social media. Actually, data actually has no owner. In Australian law and in European law, it's not considered property under the law. So we have privacy laws which protect our privacy, but we don't have data ownership laws, so you can't actually sell it, and because it's not property. So that's a really interesting space, the whole thing. So technically speaking, as long as you've protected someone's privacy, you can do what you like with their data if you get it. And look, I'm certainly never going to do that. I don't think it's a good way to proceed with your clients, is to misuse their data. Even if they've given you permission, I still wouldn't do it. But look, I think we're going to have to get. It's kind of linked a little bit to the other place. We've definitely got technology now that can share safely data and allow the owner of the data to actually, retrieve that data back without it being lost. So we've got things in place now through the ledger technology that allow that to happen. I actually think it's probably a cultural issue now. I think we need to get to a position of trust. I think, we've still really got that, I'm not giving it up and that's my competitive advantage, but I don't really think it is a competitive advantage. So, yeah, I think we've got the technology, we need to find ways to use it, and I think it's going to have to be spearheaded at a national level because it's everyone's really just copying each other in this regard at the moment.
Yeah, my comment to that is we've looked at the contracts that are in place in the construction industry, and there's not many that allow for that kind of open transparency. We're a very adversarial industry by nature. However, there are contracts in place that kind of lend itself to it, with IPDs, integrated project deliveries, and certain formats of contract. But yeah, it all comes, no matter how you write yourself around it, and you can write the clauses to say, let's be open, let's share data, let's be collaborative, you still have to bring it right back down to a human level of trust and say, well, what are you going to do with that data? That's why architects and structural engineers never used to share models with us, is they were afraid of what were we going to do with it. And again, I was saying, I'm just trying to understand the information, the data from that, so I can do my job and help the team better. And then it allowed, through years, we've now created trust, and we're given models quite openly, without writing too many waivers and things like that. We used to have to back in the day, but then you bring it right back to a human level and just show them what we're doing with it and open that up. It creates transparency. So it's got to come back to culture, it's got to come back to people, and just kind of showing knowns of like, we're not going to take you through the cleaners kind of thing and sue your ass over this kind of. It's just, you've got to go through trusted experiences as well.
I wouldn't mind. I've actually got a good example I should have shared there. Part of my value proposition is if I get enough organisational project data, you could potentially be learning from someone else's mistakes, because you don't need to do them all yourself. And from an industry's perspective, I think that's a wonderful thing, right? So why get something wrong if you don't need to, if you can learn from someone else's data? But and I've actually had one organisation, a very large organisation, say, can't we just jump on the back of someone else's? They can use ours. I was really surprised. They didn't care. They seen the opportunity, and their view was, if we can use other people's data, they can use ours. I also know another organisation, and their legal person, I was chatting to them about it, and they said, no, there's no way we're doing that. And that was, and they didn't really consider much other than that. It was just as soon as they heard, they thought, and when I say their data, I should actually put that in perspective. It's actually not data as you would know. It's actually patterns. It's patterns, and it's not got any relationship that's completely identifiable in any way or form to the actual real data. It's actually just a little bunch of numbers that I could not reverse engineer it if I tried, even knowing how the whole thing works. It just can't be done. And even then, even just the general fear that someone could get something of ours, even if it can't be used for anything other than helping. Yes. And I think, and that was coming from a head legal counsel, so I can only presume the pressures they're under, the expectations on them, is putting them in a position where they don't feel they can move forward with this kind of thing.
Yes, it's an interesting one, as well as competitive pressures. I imagine things like people with malicious intent, for example. There was an oil and gas facility in Saudi, I think, that the Russians or somebody hacked, and you just wonder, there has to be a level of control over where this data goes, but at the same time, finding that happy medium where you're sharing it to generate value on the project, I guess. So thank you for that. Does anybody from the audience have any questions? I'm just about out. I've got nothing left for these guys, but does anybody else from the audience have any questions for the panellists?
I'm very interested in programs with an early concept that you haven't got the model, and yet politicians or owners want to say, this is a big mega project or whatever project, it needs to be open for an election or some date, the Sultan's birthday, or in some ways. But at that point, nobody knows the budget, what the scope is, but sometimes we're always locked into that date and those performances and dates. And somebody said before, we've made ourselves fail already. It's how do we want to get to the model so that you can do all those calculations and things, but there's also approvals all the way through, so we live in a democracy. So all those things have to go in the program to work out the length of the project. How can we sort of stop leaders or making those pronouncements, and that with all this launch of this infrastructure spending, there's going to be lots and lots of projects with dates.
I don't pretend to have the answer to that, but you make a really good point, because that paper that I referenced at the start by the Grattan Institute, Marion Terrell and her colleagues authored, they actually identified that as one of the primary drivers of the cost overruns in government-led projects, was the fact that, and it's nothing to do with the people who work for the government, it's that the projects are announced, the budgets are announced, the whole expectation is set before any study work's been done. So no one's really had more in the back of an envelope assessment of it, and a budget's been nominated and a duration's been nominated, and now someone's political career's hanging in the balance on the back of it. You can just imagine how much pressure's been placed under that whole organisation to deliver that. And look, I'm trying to recall, they did certainly make recommendations around that, but I think, if I can remember correctly, they said we needed to separate the measurement of our performance on projects from the announcement to the kind of post-study period. It might be easier done than said than done, but they identified the fact that we didn't have a lot of control over the announcement. That was made by a body that was nothing to do with the project. And project people had to hold themselves accountable to what they committed to, not necessarily what someone else had committed to. And look, that's a political decision, right? But certainly my own career and how I manage things myself is I was always careful to make sure, delivering what I said I was going to do is really important to me. So I was always really careful what I said I was going to do. And I actually think, sometimes it takes a bit of courage, and you might actually, I would frequently put myself on the line to have awkward conversations and say I'd never committed to that, so unfortunately I can't deliver on it. I just think actually it literally comes down to individuals and courage, to be honest, and understanding when something's been committed on your behalf and you've not committed to it. And look, it's not an easy thing to do, but I tend to find that progress can't be made without risk, and that's my own answer in that regard. But
yeah, I think the example you use is politics over actual data or any analysis. So probably not a direct solution we can get out of today's workshop. However, it's probably about education, about letting the early decision makers know that there are tools and mechanisms in place to do this analysis really rapidly in the AI space, but also with BIM and models, and actually running these scenarios and saying, don't jump the gun and write one theoretical scenario and then promise the world that. Let's actually hold it for another week. Let's run the scenario and run the most efficient benefit out of it. So it's probably education on the client side, or in this case the politician side, of saying, well, just hold up a little bit, let's run the scenario in a smart way and make that commitment a little bit more stable with the data. And client education is a big part of the adoption of BIM, and why I think it's kind of slow is the end user isn't really aware normally how the job gets done. They just know they have to pay it, and they generally want it on time and on budget. I think we need to talk more to the clients and say, are you aware this is possible? Are you aware you can actually run this scenario over and over again right at the outset? And just educate people about that. Any other questions?
Okay, I've got another one. Just going back down a level, going back to ground from from starting off with the data and getting up to the politics of the world, and just coming back, something I'm curious about, just from a project planning and control perspective. So we build these models, and typically I imagine that there's different code structures that are used for the different aspects, and they're used in different ways throughout construction. So during design phase, things might be designed up in a design package, which may be different to the way that they're installed, and then when they're commissioned, they might be commissioned as systems and things like that. As part of the BIM model, is that something that can be codified, if you like, and tagged so that it's going to integrate nicely with other systems? I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's definitely good conversations around coding structures at the moment, and certainly the way you would structure quantities. I'll use a cost planning example. The way I do an estimate at the start of the project is not the way that it looks like towards tender or pre-tender before we go to construction. So I'll measure elementally, because that's in my QS brain, how I like to analyse a project and how I like to use benchmark data. But as I get closer and closer to construction, I'm going to start to talk in trades. So certainly those two things look completely different, as in substructure, columns and upper floors, walls, roofs, services, as opposed to concrete formwork, plasterboard, windows and things like that. But that doesn't mean they don't talk to each other. And coding is kind of similar. For a different point in time, different codes are useful. And And I mentioned in my presentation earlier is we've done some analysis and actually some translating between the different code systems like Uniclass, Uniformat and things like that in the BIM world. And we've actually found out that they do kind of talk to each other. It's more just which one do you choose. And about 5-10 years ago, we were trying to find the golden code structure. Like, what's the one that's going to answer everyone's situation? And we couldn't find it because there's a reason that these number of coding and classification systems exist, is they're used for different points in time and different projects. The key would be consistency and being able to flip between the two, so to be able to translate between the different ones. So there's COBE, if people are aware of that. That's a kind of classification system that's intended for the end user, and it's location-based, it's model element by model element based, it's element based, it's trade based, it's system based as well. So that one's trying to answer everything as much as possible. It's very, very complex, and there's not many people in the world that can actually translate that well. But there are those out there. At this point in time, because in Australia we don't have standardisation, not one person is using one particular classification system. And then there lies in problems is that we actually don't get any consistency either. And even in some models we see, you can see they've attempted to start a classification system and then gone, bugger it, it's a wall, just figure it out for yourself. So it's more about how we interpret that. Do standards kind of bring that in? I know in the UK they've started mandating BIM in certain aspects. I'm not sure if they've mandated certain coding systems because it still needs to be flexible enough to use for a certain output as well. So it is opening that up, but again, I'll pose a problem to that. People aren't using it well and there's no consistency in that. Sorry to be a bummer.
So if I am being the devil's advocate, if I was to say, okay, so the asset owner, they're going to wind up using this as an operational asset, should it be like a facilities management or an asset owner's sort of obligation to sort of flow that down and say, hey, this is going to be the standard or something like that?
Sorry. Yeah, it's asset owners that have the motivation to actually get it in there. So there's certain projects that we work on to mandate right at the beginning to classify it appropriately. But there's many jobs that aren't going to be retained by the asset owner. They're going to build it and sell it. They're not as interested in it. So it really does come from that motivation of the end user to say, I want my facilities manager to have this digital twin in place where if we need to maintain it, we can find it in the computer before we need to find it out on the building. They are the ones that are driving this. They're the ones that generally have the BIM mandate in place, because if you asked an architect or a designer to put classification systems in at the start, they'd probably ask you what for? Like, is it worth it at this point in time? You need to have someone at the back end with the motivation to say, yes, I want it, and yes, I want it consistently. And then have a rule checker to check that it's actually been done appropriately as well. Because we're asking a lot of our designers now. We're not just saying, make sure you build a beautiful building. We're saying, build it right, code it right from my end user, whereas all they used to do was line work. So we're asking a lot of them. We need to have gatekeepers and checkers of that as well. There's a question down the back.
My name's Louise Greenhalgh from Curry & Brown. It's interesting you mentioned about the asset owners and being engaged through the BIM process. Completely endorse that. And mentioning the UK specifying that. Going hand in hand with that was a process called government soft landings, where it was about workshopping and bringing the end users in to re-engage them with the performance targets that you set for the building. Realigning the objectives. It's sort of hand in glove with value management throughout the course of the project. So when you're doing the data drops at key interventions, you're also doing that check face-to-face, engaging with the multidisciplinary team. Is that something that's being rolled out here? So it's not just about the data, it's about the engagement and the collaboration?
Yes, to an extent, just not under a mandate. So the term soft landings is not overly familiar to me, but it sounds exactly what we've had with user groups checking in. So an example of that is the Sunny Coast University Hospital that we worked on a few years back. And we actually attended some workshops where they would do kind of a similar thing in a BIM sense. So they'd present to the users or the end users or to like the nurses for the nurse stations. They'd bring them in the user groups and say, this is kind of what it looks like in a 3D sense. What do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? And it was really interesting. More than than just showing them 2D sets of documents, they could actually kind of whip around the room and say, actually, that light switch should probably be on the left-hand side of the door because of the usability, blah, 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 blah. So that just opened up this whole new level of input right at the start of it. Again, if you're making changes, you want to do it in the design phase when it's still in a computer rather than out on site. So you can imagine changing that in a design sense. It's pretty quick. You move the light switch over to the other side of the door, your documents change, and then it's built from there. As opposed to them actually walking into the room and going, oh, it would have been nice if we had this. So yes, just not in any sort of mandated situation. It's more off the back of, again, asset retainers that have the vested interest to have these meetings. There's no, that I'm aware of, there's no kind of standard in Australia that does that. It's more just good, well-motivated asset owners that want to do that. And educated clients that know that models can be used for that purpose as well.
I've actually got a question I wouldn't mind posing. This one, I've actually got a question I wouldn't mind posing to both of you. You know, one of the things that comes up quite frequently when you're operating in the AI world, it doesn't take long before people start talking about jobs. Jobs. And could this work potentially impact jobs? And not just what I'm doing, but AI in general. I suspect that, without a doubt, that fear that it instills in some of the workforce and some people in general, it probably is stifling innovation. What do we do to try and make sure that everyone gains and gets benefits? So I'm throwing it right out there from like, obviously progress has to be made, but how do we make sure that society generally gain from the benefits of it?
That is an excellent question, and I think that's the era of new leadership that we need. And it's not, I mean, we picked on politicians a couple of times today, and it came up again here, but that's the old days where just keep it steady as she goes, and that's not really here anymore. We're past that. We're now to the point where you have to go risk and return. You have to experiment and try things, which governments aren't doing particularly well. They're letting industry lead. And hand in glove with that, I think we need this empathetic side where we're saying, okay, this is going to disrupt. How are we going to support those people? How are we going to be there so that they still have jobs, they can be repositioned, they've still got a direction and a vision that's positive when they go home to their families and those sorts of things. So I think it's going to be a double-edged thing of becoming agile and adopting to new technology and being there for the people as well to be innovatively coming up with new solutions for them. It's going to be a very interesting decade that we go through, I think.
I get posed that question quite frequently, actually, is if models can now schedule things and quantify things automatically, where does it leave the quantity surveyor when half of my job title is quantities? And I've always taken the positive aspect of leaning into that and saying, well, I don't want to count things. I didn't do a university degree to count things. I actually want to focus on the other stuff, the cool stuff that I'm interested in, actually doing cost planning, helping a client get the best benefit of their project that they can. So looking at the functional data and back analysing the project. So if the quantification can happen rapidly for me, I can focus my time and the rest of the fee on something that's more valuable to the client. However, that's kind of, I look at that in a really positive sense for my profession of how we can actually use that to our advantage and become a more reliable consultant. However, there's kind of no sugarcoating that jobs will get lost along the way, and it's that kind of empathy to say it kind of will happen, it is disruptive. When disruptive things happen, people, might not be, well, to that extent, we might not need that people power. So I'm a bit baffled as to what happens in that situation. But I do encourage people to kind of lean into that challenge and say, well, what can it let us focus on? What does that open up for us? As opposed to, woe is me.
That's a really, really valid point, I think, is seeing it coming and then preparing yourself for a better version of your role where the more routine stuff tends to get automated and replaced. I guess we're almost running out of time now, and thank you so much for all of your insights. I've learned so much about all sorts of stuff from this. I'm interested if you were just to leave us with one example, because for me it's a bit foggy, it seems really challenging and stuff. Is there one pinnacle of excellence or a country that's doing it really well or something like that we could go away from and have a read about and learn about in our own time to sort of see, well, maybe there's something we can take from that? Do either of you have any examples for that?
But it maybe doesn't fit the category of reading in your own time, but I've got a really good example of a country who's making progress and where we're struggling. So, and to try and get this off the ground, I started off using synthetic data, so completely artificial, and then I started using public domain available data, but it wasn't quite what I needed. And so when I approached the open data sites in Australia, I was told, no, look, we don't routinely give that out. I managed to get a certain amount of data, and it did help, but it wasn't really what I wanted. I tried the UK, and they went, no, we can't do it, privacy concerns. Approached the US. Yep, we'll get back to the finance department, just let us know what you need, and how would you like it? And that was literally every single part of the US I could speak to. So their view towards that, I mean, I spoke to other American people since and said, I'm astonished at how helpful the US have been. And so I'm literally a Queensland-based company who's been supported by the American government, which is a bit astonishing, but it's true. And they're really, and their view will be, look, we'd love to, find out how you're using it, what you're doing, keep in touch with us. So they're actually willing to invest money and their own resources just to actually move things forward. When you see that attitude, it's pretty scary for us, because if they're willing to do things like that, they're really going to be moving things forward there, right? In terms of like sharing things out, they've got no qualms. I've been told it's a cultural thing. It's part of that, everything in the public domain needs to be available for every single person. So I think we've got a way to go there. So yeah, I think it's our attitude perhaps towards it. We're more scared to lose than we are to win. And America is well known for having an amazing attitude to get back up. So I can see that from a data perspective.
From the BIM perspective, it's my opinion only, obviously the UK is setting the standard, they have mandated things, but I think there's a great example of BIM users in Australia, and we're quite well known for it as well in the BIM community. And that's because, particularly in southeast Queensland, and I'm Queensland based as well, so maybe I'm biased, the old Queensland government actually had departments that were right on the brink of mandating BIM, and they were heavily researching it and getting user groups to actually give information, which we were involved in, to say, well, if we do mandate it, how should we go about it so it's still a fair level playing field? And then that government kind of got broken up and departments ended up getting closed down. And what happened was the people that were in government and were researching that kind of filtered down into private enterprise. And from that, it meant that there was a lot of really good level of basis of information and skill that actually went into private enterprise. So off their own backs, companies like Mitchell Brantman and a whole other community in southeast Queensland, but certainly in Australia, were just self-driven to actually make this work and say, well, I just want to do what's best practice for my practice, and I want to collaborate. I think it's the best outcome for a design team or for a project. So we're actually kind of driving it from the ground up rather than from a government mandate down. However, because there's this big disparity between people that are good users and people that just talk, we call it BIM wash. We now start to talk about, we want that mandate because we want to be able to have a level playing field again. We don't want to go up against some competitors that say they do it, promise the world and deliver nothing. So that's where this mandate comes into it. As the UK is doing a great example from the top down, but Australia itself actually has this really nice grassroots thing where we have users just waiting for that mandate so we can start to have a level playing field.
Oh, that was absolutely awesome. So thank you so much, Caitlin. Thank you so much, Alan, for that unbelievable smorgasbord of really rich and helpful insights. So please join me in thanking them.